Welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We are starting Theme 2, titled Food Safety Systems and Innovative Technologies. Our first speaker is Mr. Richard Sprenger. He is joining us live from London. Mr. Sprenger is the chairman of the Highfield Group and holds over 50 years of food safety experience. Welcome, Mr. Sprenger, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Nora. I'll just check that just trying to share the screen. There we are. It's Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the afternoon session of the seminar. And it's a pleasure to be here from London. I'd rather be in Oman or Dubai, where I'm normally based, but because the weather's much better. But nevertheless, I'm happy to be here and talking about food safety. Thank you for the kind invitation from the organisers and the Oman Ministry. And I'm happy to talk about Hassab as one of the ways of improving food safety. But in particular, there are two aspects that I wanted to consider. One is the recent introduction of the new Codex requirements, which were published in 2020, which has made a few changes to the 12 logic steps of Hassab. And the other one is how to practically approach the implementation of Hassab, or food safety management systems, to catering businesses as opposed to manufacturing businesses. So, the Highfield Group, based in the UK, but also with the international offices in Dubai, there are 5 companies altogether involved. The qualifications arm, which is the awarding body, which is the principal operation of the business, and then we have the products group, which deals with particularly things like books and teaching aids and PowerPoints and so on. And then we have the e-learning group, the assessment group, which has mushroomed significantly with virtual assessment now and people being able to qualify at home, and then the international. And there's a few statistics there with regard to some of the more interesting aspects of the group. The other thing that I wanted to say is that it's very important that all of us that are interested in food safety keep up to date with everything that is happening. Now, years ago, that was extremely difficult, but now it's very easy, relatively easy, to keep up to date because so many organisations and governments are publishing up-to-date information about what's happening with regard to food safety. And there are many forums that are available free of charge that people can attend. This is just our example, our contribution, free of charge, of course, where people can go onto the LinkedIn Highfield Food Safety Forum and learn about what's happening in the world of food safety, not just in the UK, all over the world, talking about developments with regard to food poisoning incidents, with regard to new types of regulations and so on. So I would commend all of those interested in food safety to keep yourself up to date through the internet in particular. Now, talking about Hassab, or food safety management systems, and why is it important that we have effective food safety management systems? What do they provide? Well, the most important thing is obviously they contribute to the production of safe food, protecting the health of your customers and minimizing food complaints. They generate a food safety culture, and that is a developing topic as to enhance food safety, and certainly I don't see how you can have a good food safety culture unless you've got a good food safety management system. You'll provide increased confidence for your customers, for enforcement officers, for food inspectors, and for auditors, because if your food safety is effective, your food safety management system is effective, then they're going to be much happier when they're carrying out their inspections, the enforcement officers and auditors. One of the big factors about HACCP, as most people will know, is it's proactive. It's not reactive. It's not like sampling, which is after the food's produced. It's food safety, preventing and controlling hazards before they cause a problem. Nobody wants negative media coverage, newspapers reporting on food poisoning incidents, food complaints, and so on. HACCP will assist in ensuring that you don't get adverse publicity, which is obviously going to affect the business, and it protects your brand image. And that's particularly important because if you've got a chain with many outlets, and just one outlet with a poor food safety management system that results in a food poisoning can affect the whole of that chain. And finally, you're going to meet business customers and certification standards requirements. So most retailers will require manufacturers to have a food safety management system in place, an effective food safety management system in place, and most manufacturers do. And also, if you're going with one of the certification bodies, then again, they're going to have requirements relating to HACCP. Now, just wanted to go back to the origins of HACCP. First of all, one thing that's very important is it's a food safety management system designed to control significant hazards. That's important, but it's also resulted in a little bit of confusion as I see it when I've been inspecting businesses, that they believe that only the hazards controlled by the HACCP system are significant. That's not true, because the prerequisite programs also control significant hazards. In fact, the commonest hazards in catering, the ones that result in the prosecution, the closure of the premises, are nearly always those that are controlled by the prerequisite programs. And I'm talking about things like personal hygiene, cleaning and disinfection, and pest control. Those are the things that result. Pests are the major cause of closure of food businesses and prosecutions. Personal hygiene, extremely important, and one of the most common causes, one of the common root causes of food poisoning. And obviously, preventing cross-contamination through cleaning and disinfection is also important in preventing food poisoning. Now, HACCP was commissioned in 1959 to provide safe food from factories. It wasn't thought of at the time for catering and retailing. And it is something that has been applied in different ways in different countries, with some good results and some bad results in catering. And the other thing, as I said at the outset, that I wanted to discuss was the Codex General Principles of Food Hygiene, which are the most common standard that everybody refers to. They refer to, through a collaboration of many countries throughout the world, they look at the principles of food hygiene, but also HACCP. And there's been a few changes recently that you need to be aware of. Now, why does Hassab fail? Because it does fail. Whenever there's a food poison outbreak, that's a failure of Hassab. Whenever there's food complaints, glass in food, metal in food, chemical poisoning, all of these things are failure in Hassab. So why? The main thing, the main failure, and we've heard this morning other speakers talking about problems that have developed different areas. At the end of the day, nearly everything is down to a lack of management and owner commitment and poor management. That is the problem that needs to be targeted. If that's not right, then that is going to result in failure. A lack of knowledge and a lack of training and a lack of competence, not just about the staff, but primarily about the management. Poor hygiene practices generally, you cannot have a good, effective Hassab system in place if you've got poor hygiene practices. It can be externally imposed. And by that, I mean that management recognise in many catering operations, they don't have sufficient expertise within the business to implement a Hassab system to comply with the local enforcement requirements. And so what they often do is employ consultants. Those consultants design and implement the Hassab system without any involvement, often without any involvement or understanding from the existing management or staff. Consequently, when the enforcement officer comes round, the business is able to show that they've got a Hassab system and documentation. But the problem is it's not used because it's too complex, it's not understood, and the people within the business weren't involved or weren't involved adequately. So it's also time consuming. A Hassab system takes time to develop, to implement, to operate. And if you don't take account of this, it's going to result in failure. Poor records. You can have too little paperwork or you can have too much paperwork. And finally, it's not science-based. If it's not science-based as it should be, then you're going to have problems with your controls and critical limits. And a typical example of that would be the use of colour, for example, in catering, to determine whether or not a chicken has been cooked correctly. The use of, as is well known in the UK and many countries, they advocate the use of colour, the absence of blood running when you skewer the chicken and so on. But it doesn't work, it's not reliable, it's not as effective as using a thermometer, a probe thermometer that has been calibrated and every time recording the temperature. From my own experiences at a 5-star hotel that had an ISO 22000 Hassab in place, glowing reports from enforcement officers. I ate a meal at the restaurant there. I was served with chicken that was totally undercooked and bloody. When I investigated with the hotel and the chefs, etc., I found that they said the problem had been an inexperienced chef hadn't followed procedures correctly. That was a management breakdown, but the problem is, if you're relying on an experienced chef, how many food businesses, how many catering businesses have experienced, knowledgeable food safety chefs? Just a thought. Going on then to the implementation and the 12 steps. You'd be familiar with the first 5 steps, which are assemble a Hassab team, describe the product, identify intended use and users, construct a flow diagram, and then on-site confirmation of the flow diagram. Now, how do we apply that to catering? Well, the first problem that you hit is, can you put a Hassab team together in catering? Some catering business, certainly the larger ones, if you've got a 5-star hotel, they may have a hygiene manager, they're going to have lots of different chefs with good experience. You might have a food and beverage manager. You've got different people, but many catering businesses do not have sufficient in-house expertise to form a Hassab team in the first place. And then you've got to make a decision to bring in consultants, which is fine. Consultants can be very good to assist with the implementation of the Hassab, but it's assisting. They cannot take over the design and implementation. They've got to be part of the team, and the chef or the person in charge of the kitchen food safety should be the one that is in charge of the Hassab team. Unless you've got a hygiene manager, you want to put a hygiene manager, but the chef to me is the key person. The next thing we talk about, describing the products. But in catering, there are far too many products and there's inadequate information. When you talk about describing the products, the ingredients, and you talk about things like water availability and pH, that information isn't known. So how can you describe your products? I would suggest that in catering, what you need to look at is describing the food type. Is it low risk? Is it high risk? Is it raw, ready to eat, or is it raw to be cooked? That will enable you to ensure that cross-contamination is avoided throughout delivery, storage, preparation, etc. It's almost impossible to describe products and the intrinsic characteristics of products in catering because the information is not available. Abuse, from when we're looking at the use of the product and the users, could be takeaway, it could be self-service, mass catering, so there's potential for abuse there. The users, the main concern there is the vulnerable group. But okay, if you do supply vulnerable people, then what extra precautions can you take? The process itself should be safe. So if you're cooking chicken, it should be safe whether it's for a vulnerable person or whether it's for an ordinary person who's not vulnerable. But where you can make a difference when serving, say, in hospitals or to the very young, then what you can do is concentrate on preventing post-process contamination. So cleaning and disinfection has to be more rigorous. Personal hygiene has to be more rigorous. Look at the shelf life. Again, there was 6 people died in the UK because of sandwiches served to patients due to listeria. Watch the shelf life, prevent the cross-contamination, and avoid dangerous foods. What are dangerous foods? My definition, or what I would give you is some examples of dangerous food. It would be things like oysters, which are eaten raw milk would be another, raw bean sprouts, all of these things difficult to ensure safety, and certainly safety for vulnerable people. Pink duck is another example. Even sushi can be problematical. It's mainly raw foods that are dangerous if you can't guarantee and make them safe and get the number of bacteria down to a reasonable level. And then we talk about constructing a flow diagram. And this again, when I started many years ago looking at Hassab, we were told that you had to do flow diagrams for everything. Whereas now, it's realised that in catering, the majority of catering businesses don't need lots and lots of flow diagrams. A whole process flow diagram, and perhaps focusing on a few high-risk processes. So if you're doing something like sous vide or sushi, then you probably need separate flow diagrams. But apart from that, you don't need lots of flow diagrams. The flow diagrams you've got have to be validated. One system I would commend you to, that's available free of charge on the website, is the Scottish system of CookSafe, and they just have one flow diagram. So moving on then to the final 7 steps of the 12, which in effect are the HACCP principles. The items identified or highlighted in pink are the new additions to the Codex 2020. So these apply to manufacturing and to catering businesses. So you conduct a hazard analysis, and it's now quite clear that that is also involved in identifying control measures. So a lot of us always incorporated that within hazard analysis. Now it's being clear that within the first principle, it's conduct a hazard analysis, identify control measures. The problem is it's very difficult to gain in catering because of the lack of available information to carry out a hazard analysis, where you start looking at likelihood and severity. How do you determine the likelihood of the severity? Is it important that, yes, botulinum is more serious, arguably, than norovirus, but neither of them are acceptable. So I find for the majority of catering businesses that you should just identify the hazard and identify the control measure. Now, anybody who's operating a catering system that wants to try and do hazard analysis is welcome to try and do it, and that's not a problem. It's whatever works for you, whatever within your business you are able to do to produce safe food. So if you feel confident you can conduct hazard analysis, fine. You then move on to determine the critical control points. Now, in manufacturing, you try and minimize the number of critical control points. In catering, for high-risk food, every step is a critical control point. And nearly every catering business has the same critical control points in the generic flow diagram. And again, if you look at CookSafe, they're quite clear that they're there. As I said, apart from high-risk processes, which are separate. You don't need, yep. You need to be able to, you don't need to be able to use a decision tree, I would argue. In fact, many manufacturers now don't use decision trees. Now you have to establish validated critical limits, and the critical limits are those that provide a safe limit. It's a safe limit. There's a lot of confusion. Sometimes limits are maybe legal limits, but they're not scientifically based, but you have to go by them. So for example, 5 degrees centigrade for a refrigerator in Oman might be a legal limit. In the UK, it's 8 degrees. 63 degrees for storing hot food is the legal limit in the UK, but it's probably 60 in Oman. You've then got to establish a system to monitor the controls, establish corrective action when the monitoring indicates a deviation from the CCP has occurred, and again that's new. And then again 11, it is changed, validate the HACCP plan, and then establish procedures for verification to confirm that the HACCP system is working as intended. And the final point, establish documentation concerning all procedures and records appropriate to these principles.